The day my husband told me he wanted a divorce, I was standing at the kitchen counter cutting strawberries for our daughter's lunch. I remember the exact sound the knife made against the cutting board. I remember the way the juice ran red across the whites. I remember thinking, this is the last time I will cut strawberries in this kitchen. I've already talked to my attorney, Colin said. He didn't look at me when he said it. He was checking something on his phone, like this conversation was an errand on his to-do list. The papers are being drawn up. I think it's better for everyone if we keep this clean. I set the knife down very carefully. Better for everyone, I repeated. Don't make this dramatic, Isla. That was the moment I understood. Not just that my marriage was over, but that the man standing 6 feet away from me, in the kitchen I had designed, wearing the shirt I had picked out, had been planning this for a long time. Long enough to have an attorney. Long enough to have a plan. Long enough to have decided what was better for everyone without ever consulting me. Our daughter, Piper, was 9 years old. She was upstairs in her room doing a puzzle, completely unaware that her entire life was about to be reorganized without her consent. I picked the knife back up and finished cutting the strawberries. What I didn't tell Colin that day, what I didn't tell anyone, was that I had known something was wrong for almost 2 years. I'm not one of those women who say they never saw it coming. I saw it coming the way you see a storm building on the horizon when you're still 2 hours from home. You watch it, you calculate, you make decisions about what to grab if you have to run. I had been a financial analyst before Piper was born. Colin had asked me to step back. Just for a few years, just until she's in school, you can always go back. And I had agreed because I loved him and I believed him. But when Piper started kindergarten, there was always another reason. His promotion meant more travel and someone had to be home. His mother's health was declining. The timing wasn't right. I stayed home. I managed the household budget, the school schedules, the pediatric appointments, the holiday cards, the birthday gifts for his colleagues' children. I was good at it. I was organized and efficient, and I gave up my ambitions so quietly that even I forgot I had them. But I never forgot how to watch a spreadsheet for irregularities. About 22 months before Colin handed me those divorce papers, I started noticing things. Small withdrawals that didn't correspond to any bill I managed. A second email account that autofilled when I borrowed his laptop. A weekend conference in Austin where I couldn't find any professional event on any calendar for that weekend. I didn't confront him. That was the old Isla, the one who would have cried and asked for an explanation and believed whatever he said. Instead, I opened a savings account at a credit union across town, one Colin had no knowledge of, and I started moving small amounts into it every month. Nothing dramatic, nothing he'd notice, just the slow, quiet accumulation of an exit strategy. By the time he told me about the divorce, I had $47,000 in that account. I also had a job offer, remote, starting in 3 weeks, from a firm in Seattle that had reached out through LinkedIn 8 months earlier. I had said not yet when they called. That same afternoon, Colin told me about the papers. I called them back and said yes. His attorney was aggressive. They went after the house, the investment accounts, everything tied to his income over 14 years of marriage. Colin had the kind of lawyer who schedules depositions at 8 a.m. on Mondays specifically to grind people down. I sat across from them in a beige conference room and kept my expression completely neutral while they laid out an arrangement that was designed to leave me dependent on his goodwill. His attorney's name was Richard. He kept calling me Mrs. Whitmore in a tone that was almost pitying, like I was a child who didn't understand what was happening. I understood exactly what was happening. My own attorney, a woman named Faye who I'd researched for 2 weeks before hiring, had already walked me through every option. I took the settlement they offered on the house because fighting it would cost more than conceding. I kept the car. I kept my retirement account. I received child support for Piper, structured through the state, so that Colin's choices about whether to pay would be handled by a county enforcement agency, not by my willingness to chase him. Colin seemed surprised that I didn't cry in the conference room. I think he expected tears. I think part of him had been counting on it. What I was thinking, while Richard explained the asset division, was whether I would pack Piper's telescope first or her bookshelf. My sister June lived in Portland. When I told her I was taking the job in Seattle, she was quiet for a long moment. That's 4 states away from Colin, she finally said. Yes, I said. You planned this. I planned for this, I corrected her. There's a difference. June helped me pack. She drove a rented truck for 9 hours without complaining, and only cried once, when we carried out the rocking chair that had been our grandmother's. I made her take it with her. I didn't want anything from that house that was going to make me sentimental when I should be moving forward. Piper sat in the back seat of my car the whole drive with her headphones on, watching something on her tablet. She was quiet in the way that 9-year-olds get quiet when they're processing something too large for their vocabulary. Somewhere around the Oregon border, she took her headphones off and said, "Is Daddy going to visit?" "He can visit whenever he wants," I told her. "We'll figure it out." She put her headphones back on. I watched her in the rearview mirror for a long moment. Her father's nose, my eyes, her own entirely specific self. And I thought, I am going to get this right. Seattle took some getting used to. We moved into a 2-bedroom apartment in a neighborhood called Finney Ridge, with a view of the Cascade Mountains if you leaned out the kitchen window at the right angle. Piper enrolled in a public school 6 blocks away, and within 2 weeks had attached herself to a girl named Bex, who had a fish tank in her bedroom, and strong opinions about which dinosaurs were underrated. I started at the firm remotely and was in the office 3 days a week. It was smaller than what I'd worked at before Piper was born, and the work was more demanding, which was exactly what I needed. I wanted to be tired at the end of the day for reasons that had nothing to do with grief. Colin and I exchanged emails about scheduling. Occasionally he called Piper. The first few weeks he called regularly. By the second month, less so. By the third month, I was the one reminding Piper to text him first, which she did with the patient resignation of a child who has already begun to understand something about her father that she will spend years finding the language for. I didn't speak to Colin directly if I could help it. When I did, his voice had a particular quality to it, slightly distracted, slightly careful, that I recognized. It was the voice of someone managing multiple situations at once. I had my suspicions about who one of those situations was. Her name, I eventually learned, was Adrian. I found out the way you find out most things you already know, accidentally, while looking for something else. Piper had asked to call her father, and Colin picked up from what was clearly not his apartment, different lighting, unfamiliar art on the wall behind him. After they hung up, Piper said, "Daddy has a new apartment." "Maybe," I said. She waved at me. I kept my voice completely even. "Was she nice?" "She seemed okay." That night, after Piper was asleep, I did what any reasonable person would do and searched Colin's name alongside the address I knew he'd listed on his updated driver's license. I'd seen it on a form the school sent home. It took about 20 minutes to find a social media profile set to semi-public, belonging to a woman named Adrienne Marsh, that listed her location as Colin's neighborhood. The most recent photo was taken at a restaurant I recognized in the city we used to live in. She was laughing at something off camera. She was clearly pregnant. I stared at that photo for a long time. Then I closed the tab, made myself a cup of tea, and went to bed. Here's something nobody tells you about being blindsided. You're not always blindsided. Sometimes you see everything clearly, and the thing that undoes you is not the surprise but the confirmation. It's the moment where the shape you thought you saw in the dark turns out to be exactly what you feared, and you have to sit with the fact that your instincts were right all along and you still couldn't stop it. I had suspected Adrienne long before I knew her name. The second email account, the Austin Weekend. I would learn later that she had worked at his company for 3 years. She was 29. She had a degree in marketing and a laugh that carried across restaurants. I'm not telling you this to make her a villain. She isn't the point of this story. The point is what happened at the radiology center. 4 months after we moved to Seattle, my firm assigned me to a client in Denver. It was a 3-day engagement, an audit review for a mid-size logistics company. I flew out on a Tuesday morning, settled into a hotel, and was deep in their Q3 numbers by Tuesday afternoon when my assistant called to tell me the meeting had been moved. Our main contact had a family emergency, and the rescheduled date was 2 weeks out. I was in Denver with 2 extra days and nothing to fill them. My college roommate, Patrice, lived in Denver. She had been trying to get me to visit for 8 months. I texted her and she responded in 40 seconds with an address and a time and an all-caps instruction to bring nothing because she had already planned everything. Patrice lived in a neighborhood called Congress Park, in a Victorian house she was meticulously restoring. She had 2 dogs, a husband named Owen who made excellent pasta, and a bone-deep, unshakable certainty that everything eventually works out, which was exactly the kind of energy I needed. We had dinner. We stayed up too late. In the morning, she took me to a farmer's market, and I bought Piper a small ceramic owl because Piper was in a phase about owls. And I stood in the October sun eating a warm apple fritter and thought, I am going to be okay. On my last morning in Denver, Patrice had an appointment she couldn't move, a routine follow-up at an imaging center downtown. She apologized. I told her not to be ridiculous. I would come with her. I had nowhere to be. The imaging center was in a low, clean building near Cheeseman Park. We sat in the waiting room with paper cups of water and talked about nothing important, a podcast she'd been listening to, a movie Owen wanted to see. whether Piper would want to visit in the spring. There was one of those generic landscape prints on the wall, the kind that's chosen specifically because it reminds no one of anything. I was looking at it when the door to the waiting room opened. Colin walked in. He was wearing a gray jacket I had bought him for his birthday 3 years ago. He looked exactly the same and completely different in the way that people do when you haven't seen them in several months, and you've been quietly revising your memory of them. He didn't see me. He was looking at his phone. Behind him, with one hand on her lower back the way people do when they're uncomfortable, was a woman I recognized from a social media profile. Adrian. She was visibly pregnant, more than the photo had suggested. 7 months, maybe closer to 8. For a moment, I simply couldn't move. It wasn't fear, it wasn't anger. It was the pure, strange vertigo of running directly into a thing you had only imagined. Patrice put her hand on my arm. I exhaled. Colin looked up from his phone, the expression that moved across his face in that instant. I have thought about it many times since. It was not guilt, exactly. Of a person who has been managing 2 separate versions of reality and suddenly finds them occupying the same room. Isla, he said. Colin, I said. Adrian looked between us. She hadn't been told, I realized. Or she had been told a version. She knew there was a wife, there had to be, there was a daughter. But she clearly had not been told what the wife looked like, or that the wife had moved 4 states away. Because the expression on her face was the expression of someone encountering a ghost. What are you? Colin started. My friend has an appointment, I said. My voice was remarkably steady. I was almost impressed by myself. We were just waiting. Patrice, who is one of the most socially intelligent people I have ever met, said nothing. She simply sat very still with her hand on my arm. A nurse appeared at the door to the back hallway. Marsh? She called. Adrienne Marsh? Adrienne stood. She glanced at me once more, something complicated moving behind her eyes, and then followed the nurse through the door. Colin hesitated, visibly torn, and then followed her. He glanced back at me as the door closed. I looked at Patrice. Are you okay? She whispered. Yes, I said, which was true. I was okay. I was more than okay, in the strange disorienting way that happens when something you've dreaded turns out to be just a thing that happened. We sat in silence for a few minutes. Patrice got called back for her own appointment. I sat alone in the waiting room with the landscape print and my paper cup of water, and I thought about Piper and the ceramic owl in my bag, and whether I would get the afternoon flight or the evening one. I was almost done thinking about Colin when the door opened again. This time it was just the nurse, and she was asking a question of the waiting room in general. Something about paperwork. A form that hadn't been fully completed. She held a clipboard. She seemed flustered. Colin came back through the door behind her. His jaw was set. He walked toward me with the deliberate casualness of someone who has decided to handle a situation. We should talk, he said quietly. He sat down 2 seats away, not beside me. An appropriate distance, a negotiating distance. I don't think we need to, I said. Isla. He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his voice low. I know this looks, Colin. I looked at him directly. I'm not upset. He blinked. That wasn't the response he had prepared for. I have a job I'm good at. Piper is happy. I'm genuinely not upset. I paused. Are you okay? You look a little pale. He stared at me. I'm serious, I said. Is everything all right with the baby? Something shifted in his expression. He looked away. His jaw worked for a moment before he said quietly, They think there might be an issue with the timing. The timing, I repeated. She's further along then. He stopped, pressed his lips together. The ultrasound shows she's further along than we thought. I'm not a doctor, but I had been pregnant once, and I remembered every appointment, every measurement, every date. And I was doing the math quietly in my head, and the math was doing something uncomfortable. How much further? I asked. He didn't answer, but he didn't have to. Because if Adrienne was as far along as that nurse's comment about the ultrasound had implied, if she was closer to 8 months than 6, then the math didn't work the way Colin had presumably told her it worked. The timeline he had given her, the one that made his relationship with her the cause of his marriage ending rather than the overlap, was not the timeline the ultrasound was telling. Colin had been with Adrienne longer than he'd told her. He had let her believe she was the reason the marriage ended. She wasn't. She was part of a longer pattern that predated her entirely. I looked at Colin for a long moment. I thought about the woman in the back room, in a paper gown, discovering that the story she had been living in was not the story she thought she was living in. I thought about how that felt. I knew how that felt. I think you have a lot to figure out, I said. I stood up. I picked up my bag with the ceramic owl inside it. I walked to the window that looked out over the parking lot. The October light, the dry gold of the trees. And I waited for Patrice. Colin didn't say anything else. He went back through the door. On the plane home to Seattle, I ordered a ginger ale and put my headphones in and watched the clouds below the window for a long time without seeing them. I thought about calling June, but decided I didn't want to narrate it yet. Some things need a day or two to settle into their actual shape before you put language around them. What I knew was this. I was not glad that Adrian was in that back room, getting news she hadn't expected. I wasn't glad that Colin's careful arrangement was apparently more complicated than he'd managed. I don't believe in taking satisfaction from other people's pain, even when they've contributed to yours. But I will tell you something true. Sitting on that plane, watching the clouds, I felt, for the first time in a long time, like the weight I had been carrying had been quietly removed while I wasn't looking. Not because anything had happened to Colin, but because I could see, clearly and without grief, that his problems were entirely his own now. They had nothing to do with me. I had made myself separate from them, slowly and deliberately over 22 months, and the separation was complete. Piper got an A on her first Oregon Trail project. She has started calling Bex her best friend, with the total conviction that 9-year-olds bring to these designations. She still video calls her father, less often now, and sometimes he answers and sometimes he doesn't, and she is developing slowly. The particular resilience of children who learn early that love is something you carry yourself and not something you wait to receive. I watch her and I think about the women I know who stayed, who waited for the right moment, the right sign, the right permission to leave. I am not judging them. I know how it works. I know the way a long marriage makes you doubt your own perception until you can barely trust what you see in front of you. I also know this. The $47,000 I had saved before Colin ever said the word divorce was not a plan to leave. It was a promise to myself that I would not be caught without options, that my daughter would not watch me be defeated, that whatever happened, I would be the one standing. I still work remotely 3 days a week. On Fridays, I take Piper to a place called the Discovery Center, where they have a room full of geological specimens and a volunteer docent who is 81 years old and knows everything about igneous rock. Piper is convinced she wants to be a geologist. Last week she said so, and added, or maybe a lawyer. Can you be both? You can be anything you want to be, I told her. She considered this with the gravity of someone who is already beginning to understand that the world is more complicated than that. I know, she said. But I want to know which one pays better first. I laughed, truly laughed, the way I hadn't in a long time. Standing in that room full of rocks, watching my daughter take notes in a small spiral notebook she'd bought specifically for this purpose, I thought, this is what I was building toward. Not revenge. Not the image of Colin's face in a waiting room, not even the settlement or the job or the apartment with the mountain view. This. Exactly this. My daughter, her notebook, the particular afternoon light, the 81-year-old Reg man explaining the difference between basalt and obsidian. This was the life I had been quietly, carefully, deliberately building. And I had built it well.